Returning home early from work was never part of my routine. As the head of marketing at a tech firm, my days were usually packed with meetings, brainstorming sessions, and endless emails. But that Wednesday, I had wrapped up a major project ahead of schedule and decided to surprise my wife Sarah with an impromptu afternoon together. Pulling into the driveway, I noticed an unfamiliar car parked out front. It was a sleek black sedan, the kind that screamed executive. I brushed it off, thinking it might be a friend's or a delivery person's vehicle. Unlocking the front door, I stepped into the quiet house, expecting to hear Sarah's usual music playing or the hum of the TV in the background. Instead, there was silence. "Sarah," I called out, setting my briefcase by the door. No response. The house felt unusually still, an unsettling quiet that gnawed at my gut. As I walked through the hallway, I noticed the door to our bedroom was slightly ajar. The closer I got, the more I heard faint voices. One was unmistakably Sarah's, but the other was male, unfamiliar, and deep. My heart started to race, a mix of confusion and unease washing over me. Pushing the door open, I was hit by the sight that would change everything. There, on our bed, was Sarah with Miguel, a young Mexican employee from my team. They were locked in an embrace, their bodies tangled in a way that left no room for misinterpretation. For a moment, time stood still. My mind raced, trying to comprehend the scene before me. How long had this been going on? Why Miguel? The questions spun around, each one hitting harder than the last. Sarah noticed me first, her eyes widening in shock as she pushed Miguel away. "James!" she gasped, scrambling to cover herself. Miguel sat up, his face a mix of fear and embarrassment. "What the hell is going on here?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper but carrying the weight of 1,000 accusations. "James, I can explain," Sarah started. But I was in no mood to hear her out. The betrayal cut too deep, and the anger was beginning to boil over. "I think you've said enough," I snapped, turning on my heel and storming out of the room. I could hear Sarah calling after me, but her words were just noise against the roaring in my ears. The life I thought I knew was unraveling, and all I could do was try to hold on as everything fell apart. I found myself outside, sitting on the porch steps, trying to catch my breath. The cool air did little to calm the storm inside me. Memories of happier times with Sarah flashed through my mind. Our wedding day, vacations, quiet evenings at home. Each memory was now tainted by the image of her with Miguel. The reality of her betrayal was like a punch to the gut. How had I missed the signs? Had there been any? I thought about our conversations, her recent late nights, the vague excuses. Suddenly, they all made sense. The pieces of the puzzle fell into place, forming a picture I never wanted to see. I heard the door creak open behind me. Sarah stepped out, wrapping a robe tightly around herself. She approached cautiously, her face streaked with tears. "James, please," she said softly. "We need to talk about this." I looked up at her, the woman I had loved and trusted for years, the woman who had just shattered my world. "Talk?" I repeated, my voice hollow. "I don't think there's anything left to say." Her face crumpled, and she sank down beside me, her shoulders shaking with sobs. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her out of habit, but I couldn't. The pain was too raw, the betrayal too fresh. We sat there in silence, the weight of what had happened hanging heavy between us. The first cracks in our marriage had been revealed, and I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The days following my discovery of Sarah's infidelity were a blur. I spent most of my time in a haze of anger and disbelief, going through the motions at work and avoiding home as much as possible. When I did go home, the atmosphere was tense and unbearable. Sarah tried to talk to me several times, but I couldn't bring myself to listen. Every time I looked at her, I saw her with Miguel. One evening, about a week after the incident, I found myself alone in my office at home. Sarah was out, supposedly running errands, but I couldn't shake the nagging doubt that had taken root in my mind. I decided it was time to dig deeper, to uncover the full extent of her betrayal. I opened her laptop, which she had carelessly left on the desk. She had never been very cautious about her passwords, and within minutes, I was scrolling through her emails and messages. My heart pounded as I sifted through the digital remnants of our life together, searching for any evidence that would confirm my suspicions. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. There were numerous messages between Sarah and Miguel, some innocuous, but others blatantly incriminating. They had been meeting regularly, their exchanges filled with intimate details and plans for future rendezvous. The messages painted a clear picture of an ongoing affair that had been happening right under my nose. One particular message stood out. It was from the day I had caught them together. Miguel had written, "I can't wait to see you again. James won't be home until late, right?" Sarah's reply had been a simple, "Yes, he's always working late." The casualness of their deceit hit me like a sledgehammer. As I read through their conversations, my emotions swung wildly between rage and heartbreak. How could she do this to me? To us? The betrayal felt like a physical wound, one that festered with each new revelation. In a fit of anger, I slammed the laptop shut and paced around the room. I felt trapped, like a caged animal with no escape. The life I thought I knew was crumbling around me, and I didn't know how to piece it back together. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying everything in my mind. The questions that had plagued me since that fateful day resurfaced with renewed intensity. How long had this been going on? What had I done to drive her into another man's arms? Was it something I could have prevented? The next morning, I decided I needed to confront Miguel. I couldn't let this continue without addressing it head on. I knew where he lived. He had mentioned his address in one of his messages to Sarah. After work, I drove to his apartment complex, my mind a whirlwind of thoughts and emotions. When I arrived, I found myself hesitating. What was I going to say? How was I going to handle this? I took a deep breath and steeled myself. I had to do this, for my own peace of mind. I knocked on his door, and after a few moments it opened. Miguel stood there looking surprised and somewhat nervous. "James," he said, his voice shaky. "What are you doing here?" "We need to talk," I replied, pushing past him into the apartment. I wasn't in the mood for pleasantries. Miguel closed the door and turned to face me. "Look, I know you're angry," he began. But I cut him off. "Angry doesn't even begin to cover it," I said, my voice cold. "How long has this been going on?" He hesitated, then sighed. "About 6 months," he admitted. "It started off as just flirting, but it got out of hand." "Out of hand?" I echoed, incredulous. "You think this is just a mistake?" "You betrayed me, and you betrayed my trust in you as an employee." Miguel looked down, unable to meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, James. I never meant for it to go this far." "Sorry?" I scoffed. "Sorry doesn't change anything. You knew exactly what you were doing." The conversation continued in circles, with Miguel offering weak apologies and me venting my anger and frustration. In the end, I left feeling just as empty and betrayed as when I had arrived. Confronting him had done nothing to ease the pain. Back at home, Sarah was waiting for me. She looked anxious, probably sensing that something was wrong. "Where have you been?" she asked, her voice tinged with worry. "I went to see Miguel," I replied bluntly. Her eyes widened in shock, and for a moment she was speechless. "James, please," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "I don't want to hear it," I said, my voice hard. "I found your messages. I know everything." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she reached out to touch my arm, but I pulled away. "James, I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you." "But you did," I replied, my voice cold and detached. "And now we have to figure out what happens next." The reality of our situation hit us both hard. The life we had built together was shattered, and the road ahead was uncertain. But one thing was clear. We couldn't go on like this. Something had to change, and it was up to us to decide what that would be. The days following my confrontation with Miguel and Sarah's tearful apology were some of the darkest I had ever experienced. The weight of her betrayal was a constant presence, an ache that refused to subside. We tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy, but it was like trying to hold together a crumbling facade. Every interaction was strained, every conversation laced with unspoken tension. One evening, I returned home from work to find Sarah sitting at the kitchen table, a half-empty glass of wine in front of her. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "We need to talk," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I sighed, feeling the exhaustion seep into my bones. "What is there left to say, Sarah? We've been over this. Please, James, she pleaded. I need to explain. I need you to understand why this happened. Reluctantly, I sat down across from her. Fine. Talk. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. I know I hurt you, and I hate myself for it. But you have to know that I never stopped loving you. It felt like you weren't there anymore. You were always so busy with work, and I felt so alone. I listened, my emotions a turbulent mix of anger and sadness. And you thought cheating on me would fix that? No, she said quickly, shaking her head. I know it was wrong. But it was like I needed to feel something again. To feel wanted. Miguel was there, and he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Her words cut deep, each one a reminder of the distance that had grown between us. You should have talked to me, Sarah. We could have worked through this together. I tried, she said, tears spilling down her cheeks. But every time I brought it up, you brushed me off. You were always too busy or too tired. I felt like I was losing you, like we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to stop it. I rubbed my temples, trying to process everything she was saying. So what now? Where do we go from here? I don't know, she admitted, her voice small. But I want to try to make things right. I want to fix this, if you'll let me. I looked at her, the woman I had loved for so many years, now a stranger sitting across from me. The pain of her betrayal was still raw, but there was a part of me that wanted to believe her, that wanted to find a way to rebuild what we had lost. Okay, I said slowly, but it's not going to be easy, and it's going to take a lot of work from both of us. She nodded, a flicker of hope in her eyes. I know, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes. We spent the next few weeks in a delicate dance, trying to navigate the fragile truce we had established. We attended couples counseling, where we began to unpack the years of resentment and miscommunication that had led us to this point. It was a painful process, but it also brought moments of clarity and understanding. One evening, after a particularly intense counseling session, I found myself alone in our bedroom. Sarah had gone to visit her sister for the weekend, giving us both some much-needed space. I sat on the edge of that bed, staring at the framed photos on the dresser, reminders of happier times that now felt like a lifetime ago. The doorbell rang, pulling me from my thoughts. I opened the door to find Tom, my best friend, standing on the porch. Hey man, he said, offering a small smile. Thought you could use some company. I nodded, stepping aside to let him in. We settled in the living room, beers in hand, the silence between us comfortable and familiar. How are you holding up? Tom asked after a while, his tone gentle. I shrugged, taking a sip of my beer. Some days are better than others. It's a lot to process. I can't even imagine, he said, shaking his head. But I'm here for you, whatever you need. Thanks, I said, appreciating his support. It's hard, you know? I keep replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out where it all went wrong. Tom nodded. It's natural to want to make sense of it, but sometimes things just happen, and there's no clear answer. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the situation hanging heavy in the air. Eventually, Tom spoke again. Have you thought about what you want to do? About your future? I sighed, running a hand through my hair. I don't know. Part of me wants to fight for our marriage, to see if we can make it work. But another part of me is so angry and hurt that I don't know if I can ever truly forgive her. Whatever you decide, just make sure it's what's best for you, Tom said. You deserve to be happy, James. Don't lose sight of that. His words resonated with me, a reminder that amidst the chaos and pain, I had to prioritize my own well-being. As I lay in bed that night, I realized that the road ahead was still uncertain, but I was determined to find a way forward, whether that meant rebuilding my marriage or starting anew on my own. The uneasy truce Sarah and I had forged began to feel more like a fragile ceasefire. The counseling sessions were grueling, dredging up buried resentments and old wounds. Sarah was trying, I could see that, but the betrayal was too fresh, the trust too shattered. The more we talked, the more I realized how deeply her affair had affected me. One day, as I was leaving work, I ran into my boss, David. He was the last person I wanted to see, given everything that had happened. David had always been a tough, no-nonsense type, but now, every interaction felt loaded with suspicion and tension. James, can I have a word? David asked. his tone making it clear it wasn't a request. I nodded, following him into his office. He closed the door behind us, his expression unreadable. "I've noticed your performance has been slipping lately. Is everything okay?" I took a deep breath, deciding to be honest. "No, it's not. My wife, Sarah, she's been having an affair. It's been difficult." David's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hard edge to his gaze. "I'm sorry to hear that, James, but you need to get your head back in the game. This project is too important," I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and helplessness. "I understand. I'll do my best." As I walked out of his office, I felt a surge of determination. I couldn't let Sarah's betrayal ruin everything I had worked so hard for. I needed to take control of my life, to find a way to regain my footing. That evening, I sat down at my computer and began to dig deeper into Sarah's affair. I wanted to know everything: when it started, how often they met, what they talked about. I hacked into her social media accounts, finding messages and photos that made my blood boil. Every new piece of evidence felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Then I found something that changed everything: an email from Miguel, detailing a plan to leave town together. They were planning to run away, to start a new life far from the mess they had created. The date was set for the following week. A cold fury settled over me. I couldn't let them get away with this. They had destroyed my life, and now they were planning to escape the consequences? I wouldn't let that happen. The next day I called my lawyer, Marcia. "I need to file for divorce," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. Marcia didn't seem surprised. I thought this might be coming. "Let's meet tomorrow to go over the details." We spent the next few days preparing the paperwork. I gathered all the evidence of Sarah's affair, making sure we had everything we needed to ensure the divorce would be uncontested. The hardest part was telling Sarah. I waited until she came home from work, her face lighting up with a tentative smile when she saw me. "James, I was thinking we could go out for dinner tonight. Maybe try to reconnect." I shook my head, holding up the divorce papers. "Sarah, it's over. I've filed for divorce." Her face went pale, her eyes wide with shock. "James, no, please, we can work this out." I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly extinguished by the memory of her betrayal. "It's too late for that, Sarah. I know about your plan with Miguel. I know you're planning to leave." She stared at me, her expression crumbling. "How did you—" "It doesn't matter," I interrupted. "What matters is that this marriage is over. Pack your things and go. I don't want to see you here when I get back." Sarah burst into tears, but I couldn't bring myself to comfort her. I left the house, needing to get away from the toxic atmosphere. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process everything that had happened. When I finally returned home, it was late. The house was dark and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos of my thoughts. Sarah's things were gone, her presence erased from our home. Over the next few days, I focused on finalizing the divorce and cutting ties with Sarah. It was painful, but it was necessary. I needed to move on, to find a way to rebuild my life without her. The divorce proceedings were swift and relatively painless, thanks to the mountain of evidence I had gathered. Sarah didn't contest anything. She knew she was in the wrong, and she seemed eager to get it over with. We signed the papers in a sterile conference room, the finality of it all hitting me like a freight train. As we walked out of the building, Sarah tried to speak to me, but I cut her off. "Just go, Sarah. You've made your choice." She nodded, tears streaming down her face as she walked away. I watched her go, feeling a mix of relief and sorrow. It was truly over. I threw myself into my work, trying to drown out the pain with productivity. David noticed the change and gave me more responsibilities, which helped keep my mind occupied. I also started seeing a therapist, Dr. Ellis, who helped me navigate the emotional aftermath of the divorce. "You're doing well, James," Dr. Ellis said during one of our sessions. "It's okay to grieve, but it's also important to focus on your future." I nodded, feeling the weight of his words. The future. It seemed like an abstract concept, but I knew I needed to start thinking about it. A few weeks later, I received a call from Tom. "Hey, man, I heard from a mutual friend that Sarah and Miguel left town." I felt a pang of betrayal all over again, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of finality. "Good riddance," I muttered. "How are you holding up?" Tom asked, his concern evident. "I'm getting there," I replied. One day at a time. With Sarah and Miguel gone, I felt a strange sense of liberation. The burden of their betrayal was still there, but it was no longer a constant presence. I focused on myself, on rebuilding my life from the ground up. I moved into a new apartment, a fresh start in every sense. It was smaller than our house, but it was mine. I decorated it with things that brought me joy: art, books, and plants. It became a sanctuary, a place where I could heal and rediscover who I was. I also reconnected with old friends, people I had lost touch with during my marriage. We went out for drinks, caught up on each other's lives, and laughed about old times. It felt good to be surrounded by people who cared about me,